My name is Jake Harper, and I was 32 when this happened. I still remember it clearly, though I try not to. It was supposed to be a simple RV trip. Just my sister Amber, my best friend Logan, Amber's friend Maya, and me. We were heading to Wallowa-Whitman National Forest in Oregon, to a place called The Hollow. Amber swore it would be beautiful, untouched by tourists, and a perfect place to bond. She always had these ideas about reconnecting with nature and each other. The trip didn't start off bad. The four of us piled into a creaky, rented RV on a crisp October morning. Logan cracked jokes, Amber played DJ, and Maya quietly read a book about local Native American history, but things started going wrong even before we reached the forest. The RV wasn't in great shape. The generator sputtered constantly, and the headlights flickered in the evening like a dying flashlight. "Quality rental," Logan quipped, kicking the dashboard as if that would help. I tried to stay positive for Amber's sake. She'd been pushing for this trip for weeks. "Relax. We'll be parked soon," I said, though the forest around us was getting darker, and I couldn't see the campsite she'd marked on her map. We finally found a clearing to park the RV just before sunset. It wasn't the campsite Amber had in mind, but it would have to do. The forest loomed around us, thick and quiet, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "This place is remote," Maya said, her voice hesitant. "That's the point," Amber replied, hopping out of the RV with her camera. That night, after a mediocre dinner of canned chili and some beers, I heard something strange. It started as a low growl, deep, guttural, and too loud to be a coyote. It circled the RV, moving slowly. "Did you hear that?" I asked, standing near the door. "Probably just an animal," Logan said, yawning. "This is their turf, after all." Amber peered out the window. "It's nothing. Come on, Jake, don't start freaking out on me." But it didn't feel like nothing. That sound wasn't natural, and it wasn't the only thing that gave me pause. The next morning, Amber insisted on exploring. We found a ring of old stones a little way from our camp, etched with faint carvings. "What do you think this is?" she asked, snapping photos. "It's probably some kind of marker," I said, brushing it off. But Maya knelt down, running her fingers over the carvings. "This is a warning," she murmured. "Something about not calling its name." She glanced at Amber nervously. "We should leave this alone." Logan, of course, made a joke. "What, like it's cursed or something? Should I say the name 3 times to see what happens?" "Don't," Amber snapped, startling us all. Her face was pale. "Just don't." Amber wouldn't let us leave without seeing the hollow. It took us 2 hours of rough hiking to get there. The trail was overgrown, and we had to navigate around thick underbrush. Along the way, we found claw marks on the trees, fresh and jagged. "Cougar, maybe?" Logan said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. We finally reached the hollow, a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering rock walls. It was breathtaking, sure, but there was something oppressive about it too. The air felt heavier, and even Logan stopped joking. Amber set up her camera while the rest of us tried to relax. But then, as we were unpacking lunch, Amber froze. "Did you call me, Jake?" she asked. "No," I said. "Why?" "I heard you, back on the trail." Her voice wavered. That evening, back at the RV, things got worse. The first sign was the smell, rotting meat and wet fur. It was so strong I gagged, but we couldn't find the source. Then Logan stepped outside to check the generator and came back looking pale. I saw something," he stammered. "What?" I asked. "A deer. Only it wasn't a deer, it was walking on 2 legs." "You're messing with us," I snapped, though my heart was pounding. "I'm not," he shouted. It looked at me, Jake. Its eyes. He didn't finish because we heard it then. A low, guttural sound, almost like laughter, coming from the woods. Amber woke us all in the middle of the night. "Something's outside," she whispered. Her face was ghostly white. We looked out the window and saw it. A gaunt figure, hunched and wrong, with glowing yellow eyes. It moved like a predator, circling the RV. "It's just trying to scare us," I said, trying to keep calm. "What the hell is that?" Logan hissed. "A skinwalker," Maya whispered, as if saying it any louder would bring it closer. "It's a Navajo legend, a shifter. It takes the form of animals. Or people." "People?" Logan asked. Maya nodded. "It mimics voices, too." My blood ran cold. Amber thought I called her on the trail. The creature slammed its body against the RV, rocking it violently. Amber screamed, and I grabbed a hunting knife from the drawer, though I knew it was useless. "It's trying to get us to run," Maya said. "Don't leave the RV." "But we can't just sit here," Logan yelled. The skinwalker shrieked, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. I made a decision then. "I'll lead it away," I said. "Jake, no!" Amber cried. "We don't have a choice. It's going to get in if we stay." I stepped outside, heart hammering. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Its form flickered between a deer and something human. "Come on!" I shouted, waving my arms. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate. I backed into the trees, leading it away from the RV. I don't remember much about that night. Just running, the sound of branches snapping, and the creature's glowing eyes always just behind me. But as the first light of dawn broke, the forest fell silent. The skinwalker stopped following me and slunk back into the shadows. I made my way back to the RV, exhausted but alive. The others had already started walking toward the ranger station, and we reunited hours later. The ranger didn't seem surprised when we told him what happened. "You're lucky it let you leave," he said. "Next time, stay out of the hollow." We never spoke of the trip again. Amber stopped trying to convince me to go camping. Logan moved out of state not long after, and Maya sent me books on folklore that I haven't touched. As for me, I still love the outdoors, but I've learned to respect what I don't understand. There are places humans aren't meant to go, and the Hollow is one of them. If you're ever in Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, remember this: don't go looking for what's not meant to be found. My name is Claire Bishop, and I was 28 when it happened. I didn't set out to find ghosts or unravel some tragedy from the past. I just wanted to be alone. After my breakup with Eric, I needed a reset, a chance to clear my head and refocus on what mattered. So I packed up my little RV, grabbed my camera, and headed to Hell's Canyon National Recreation Area in Oregon. I wasn't a novice to the outdoors. Growing up in Washington State, I spent weekends hiking with my dad, learning the basics of wilderness survival. I thought I could handle a solo trip. Hell's Canyon seemed like the perfect destination. Remote, beautiful, and far enough away that I wouldn't accidentally bump into anyone I knew. I didn't know, as I drove down the winding road to my campsite, that I'd be leaving more than just my troubles behind. The road to the canyon was harrowing. Steep drop-offs with no guardrails, gravel that slid under my tires, and hairpin turns that made my stomach lurch. I white-knuckled the wheel and told myself the view would be worth it. And it was. When I finally reached the overlook, the Snake River stretched out below me, shimmering under the late afternoon sun. The cliffs were jagged and raw, like the earth itself had been torn open. I parked my RV at a small clearing that wasn't part of any official campground. That was part of the appeal. No crowds, no noise. Just me and the wild. As I set up camp, an older man in a park ranger's uniform appeared out of nowhere. His weathered face and piercing eyes reminded me of my grandfather. "You planning to stay here long?" he asked, his tone curt. "Just a few nights," I said. "Why?" "This spot ain't exactly friendly." He glanced toward the canyon. "You'll hear things down there, echoes." I laughed nervously. "It's a canyon. Isn't that the whole point?" His gaze hardened. "Not the kind you're thinking of. This place has history, the kind that doesn't stay buried. Don't go digging where you don't belong." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the gravel. I watched him disappear into the trees, a strange unease settling over me. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. I crawled into bed and tried to sleep, but around midnight I heard it. Faint singing carried on the breeze. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I sat up and strained to listen, the melody grew clearer. It was soft, mournful, and distinctly human. I got out of bed and peered through the RV window. The moon cast long shadows over the canyon, but there was no sign of anyone. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me and went back to bed. But the unease lingered. The next morning, I decided to explore. With my camera slung around my neck, I hiked along a faint trail that wound down into the canyon. The air was cooler down there, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the shadows cast by the cliffs. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a strange sight. A cluster of rusted mining equipment half buried in the dirt. Old pickaxes, a broken lantern, and what looked like the remains of a rail track leading to a collapsed mine entrance. I snapped a few photos, my curiosity piqued. This must have been part of the mining town the ranger mentioned. The tracks were overgrown with moss, and the wooden beams of the mine shaft had long since rotted away. I crouched to examine a piece of metal and felt a sudden chill, as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. "Don't go digging where you don't belong." The ranger's warning echoed in my mind, but I shook it off. This was just history, fascinating, forgotten history. That night, back in the RV, things started to feel wrong. I was editing the photos I'd taken when I noticed something strange. In one of the shots of the mine entrance, there was a figure, a translucent, shadowy figure, standing just inside the collapsed shaft. My first thought was that it was a trick of the light, maybe lens flare. But the longer I stared at it, the harder it was to convince myself. I closed my laptop and went to bed, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. But then, around midnight, the singing started again. This time, it was louder, closer, and unmistakably real. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The canyon was bathed in moonlight, and everything looked still. But the singing continued, coming from somewhere near the ridge. It sounded like a man's voice, low and sorrowful. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The singing stopped. I spent the next day on edge, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went back to the mine, hoping to find some logical explanation for the figure in my photo. Instead, I found something even stranger. A single, fresh footprint in the dirt, leading into the collapsed shaft. I turned back toward camp, my nerves fraying. As I approached the RV, I saw him. Standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, was a man. He wore old-fashioned clothing, a wide-brimmed hat and suspenders, and he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. "Who are you?" I shouted, more angry than scared. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed toward the canyon. Then he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next he wasn't. That evening, the ranger returned. His face was drawn, and his usual gruffness was replaced with urgency. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." I showed him the photo of the figure in the mine. "Who is this?" His expression darkened. "You're meddling in things you don't understand. The miners down there, they died angry. Some say they haunt this place, reliving their last moments. And some—" He trailed off, his gaze darting toward the canyon. "Some what?" I pressed. "They don't let people leave." I didn't listen. I couldn't. Something was drawing me back to the mine, a pull I couldn't explain. That night, armed with a flashlight and a pickaxe I'd found near the old equipment, I returned. The whispers started as soon as I stepped inside the shaft. They grew louder with each swing of the pickaxe, and the air grew colder. Finally, I broke through a thin wall of rubble and stumbled into an open chamber. What I saw will haunt me forever. The miners were there, not alive, but not quite dead either. Their translucent forms moved in a grotesque loop, swinging pickaxes and clawing at the walls, their faces twisted in agony. At the center of it all was the Echo Man, his form now warped and monstrous. He turned toward me, and I felt an overwhelming wave of anger and despair. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice echoing off the walls. I ran. The spirits swarmed behind me, their anguished cries filling the air. When I reached the RV, it wouldn't start. The spirits surrounded me, their hands slamming against the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. I remembered something the ranger had said about respecting the dead. Desperate, I grabbed the artifacts I'd taken from the mine and threw them outside. "I'm sorry," I screamed. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The banging stopped. Slowly, the spirits faded, and the air grew still. The RV finally started, and I drove all night to get as far away from that place as possible. When I got home, I checked my camera. Every photo I'd taken in the canyon was gone, except for one. A blurry image of the Echo Man, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I haven't gone camping since, and I never will. If you're ever in Hell's Canyon, remember this. Some echoes are better left unheard. My name is Jack Reynolds, and I was 45 when this happened. After 20 years as a cop, I retired last spring. It wasn't a planned retirement. I just couldn't take the job anymore. There's only so much death and guilt a man can carry before it starts eating him alive. So, I packed up my life in Portland, bought a second-hand RV, and decided to hit the road. No deadlines, no bosses, just me and the open sky. This trip to Tilamook State Forest was supposed to be peaceful. A few days of solitude, a chance to clear my head. But instead, it became something I'll never forget, and something I wish I could. The forest was more isolated than I expected. I'd read about this spot near the old Trask River logging camp, an abandoned site from the 1940s. The history fascinated me. Stories of missing loggers, a mystery no one could explain. I thought the quiet would do me good. The drive to the campground wasn't easy. The dirt road twisted like a snake, narrow and full of potholes. My RV jolted and rattled the whole way, but I finally made it just before sunset. The spot was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens with a view of the river in the distance. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I set up a fire, ate a quick dinner, and let the silence wrap around me. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. That night, though, I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, almost melodic. But as I lay in my bunk, the sound grew clearer, more deliberate. It was like someone was speaking just outside the RV. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. "Hello?" I called, stepping outside with a flashlight. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows and fog. I stood there for a while, listening, but the whispers stopped. I told myself it was my imagination and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep much. The next afternoon, as I was setting up my camera to take some shots of the forest, I heard a voice. A real voice this time, not the whispers. "Hey, over here!" A young woman stumbled into the clearing, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She looked like she'd been out here for days, clothes torn, hair matted, and eyes wide with panic. "Are you okay?" I asked, rushing to help her. She nodded, trembling. "I got lost. I've been wandering for hours." I led her to the fire and gave her some water. She introduced herself as Laura, a hiker from Salem. She'd come to the forest to find the remains of the Trask River logging camp. "It's part of my family history," she said. "My great-grandfather was one of the loggers who disappeared here." Her words gave me pause. "Disappeared? You mean the old stories?" She nodded. "They say the camp was cursed, that something in the woods took them." I didn't laugh. I'd seen too much in my career to dismiss anything outright. "You should have brought a map," I said instead. She gave me a weak smile. "Yeah, I guess I should have." That night, Laura stayed at my campsite. She seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder every few minutes like she expected something to leap out of the trees. I didn't blame her. There was something off about this place. It wasn't just the whispers. My RV's radio turned on by itself, blaring static. The campfire flickered even though the air was still. And when I went to grab my camera, I found strange symbols etched into the dirt nearby, circles and lines that looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. Laura's face went pale when she saw them. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, we heard a sound. A soft, lilting voice, singing in the distance. The melody was haunting, like a lullaby from a dream. "That's her," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Who?" I asked. "The Shadow Woman. She lures people into the woods, and they never come back." I didn't believe her, not at first. Ghost stories weren't my thing. But when I looked up, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, dressed in black. Her face was obscured by a veil, but I could feel her eyes on me. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, waiting. And I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at her, but the beam passed through her like smoke. Laura grabbed my arm. "Don't go near her," she pleaded. But I was already walking toward the figure. I didn't want to. Something inside me, a voice, a pull, drove me forward. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, like 1,000 voices murmuring in my head. "You failed them," the whispers said. "You let them die." I froze. The Shadow Woman raised a hand and pointed to the woods. Then she vanished. The next morning, Laura and I decided to find the old camp. If this Shadow Woman was real, if she was tied to the missing loggers, maybe we could figure out how to stop her. The remains of the camp were eerie. Rusted tools and machinery lay scattered among the trees, overgrown with moss. We found an old cabin, its roof caved in, and inside we discovered a diary. The entries were cryptic, written by a man named Thomas, one of the loggers. He described strange occurrences in the weeks before the camp was abandoned. Shadows moving between the trees, voices calling their names, and a woman in black who appeared at night. The last entry read, "She whispers promises of riches and safety, but they are lies. We cannot leave. She won't let us." That evening, the Shadow Woman returned. This time, she stood closer, just beyond the campfire. Her veil lifted slightly, revealing a hollow void where her face should have been. "You can't run from this," the whispers said. "You can't save her." The words cut deep. They weren't just random, they were personal, echoing the guilt I carried from my last case as a cop. I tried to block them out, but they grew louder, relentless. Laura pulled me back into the RV, her eyes wide with fear. "She feeds on guilt," she said. "She knows your weakness." We couldn't stay. The shadow woman was getting stronger, and I could feel my grip on reality slipping. We tried to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The whispers filled the air, growing into a deafening roar. Desperate, Laura remembered something from the diary, a ritual the loggers used to repel her. "We need fire," she said, "a circle of fire." We doused the ground around the campsite with gasoline and lit it. The flames roared to life, creating a barrier between us and the shadow woman. She screamed, a high, piercing wail that rattled my bones, and disappeared into the smoke. The fire burned out and the forest fell silent. The RV finally started, and we drove away without looking back. Laura thanked me for helping her, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt hollow, like the forest had taken a piece of me. Back home, I tried to forget what happened, but at night I still hear the whispers. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her standing at the edge of the trees, waiting. If you ever go to Tilamook State Forest, be careful. Some things should stay buried. My name is Dan Taylor, and I'm 44 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last summer when my family and I decided to spend a week camping near Mount Hood in Oregon. I wanted an adventure, a break from the endless routine of modern life, a chance for my wife and kids to bond without screens. I got far more than I bargained for. It started as a simple family trip, the kind you imagine will be full of laughter and scenic hikes. My wife Karen, 42, was hesitant about going so deep into the woods, but she agreed to humor me. My son Jake, 16, was glued to his phone and headphones moaning about missing some party back home, and my daughter, Lily, 13, was the most excited, thrilled at the thought of exploring nature and snapping photos for her scrapbook. We drove our old RV up to the Ramona Falls Trail. It was remote enough to escape the crowds, but the terrain wasn't supposed to be too challenging. I'd looked it up. Beautiful waterfalls, lush forests, and no cell service. A perfect escape. At least, that's what I thought. The trip started with the usual hiccups. Jake complained the entire drive, and when we set up camp I discovered that our water filter had cracked during storage. Karen gave me a long look, the kind that said, "I told you, we should have checked the gear." I waved her off and said we'd boil water. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. On the first evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Lily came back from exploring nearby. She looked uneasy. "Dad, I saw something weird," she said, holding up her phone. "Look at these carvings." She'd taken pictures of trees marked with strange symbols. They weren't your typical graffiti, more like ancient etchings, spirals, and jagged lines. I laughed and said it was probably some bored kids messing around. "Relax, Lily, it's nothing," I said, patting her on the shoulder. "But they were all over, like a lot of them," she insisted. Karen glanced at the pictures and frowned. "They don't look random, Dan. Maybe they're from some local group or something." "They're harmless," I said, trying to downplay her concern. "Come on, let's get dinner going." That night, as we sat around the campfire, the woods felt off. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I'd expected. Instead, it was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. Karen mentioned it, but I told her it was just the remoteness of the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. Distant laughter, faint and echoing through the trees. I sat up in the RV, straining to hear. At first, I thought it was animals, but the sound didn't fit. It was human, but unnatural, like someone laughing just to unsettle you. I checked on Karen and the kids. They were all asleep. I decided not to wake them, chalking it up to my imagination. But when I looked out the window, I thought I saw movement, just the shadow of something slipping between the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the moonlight and went back to bed. The next morning, Lily brought it up again. "Did anyone hear laughing last night?" Karen's face tightened, but I shook my head. "It's just the wind through the trees, Lily." Jake snorted. "Sure, Dad. Wind sounds like laughing. Totally logical." Karen shot me a look, but I doubled down. "Let's not scare ourselves over nothing." The second night, things got worse. We heard footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate. Karen grabbed my arm. "Dan, someone's out there." I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no one. The footsteps stopped as soon as I opened the door. When I inspected the RV in the morning, I found scratch marks along one side. Deep grooves, like something sharp had dragged across the metal. I tried to brush it off, telling Karen it was probably animals. But I wasn't so sure anymore. Lily wandered farther than usual that afternoon. When she came back, her face was pale. "I found something," she whispered. She led us to a cave about half a mile from the campsite. Inside were piles of bones, animal and human, all arranged in disturbing patterns. The walls were covered in more of those symbols, etched in a way that looked frantic, desperate. In the center of the cave was a totem made of sticks and skulls. "We're leaving," Karen said immediately. "We can't overreact," I argued, though my stomach churned. "Maybe it's old, or part of some ritual from years ago." Karen glared at me. "Does it matter? It's not safe here." Jake, for once, agreed. "Dad, this is messed up. Let's go." But when we returned to the RV, we found the tires slashed. All of them. The air had been let out, and the rubber was shredded. Karen looked at me, her face pale. "What now, Dan?" That night, we barricaded ourselves in the RV. We heard them coming long before we saw them. The same laughter, this time louder, more menacing. Shadows moved outside, and the RV shook as something pounded against the walls. Jake grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit. "We're not just sitting here," he yelled. A face appeared at the window, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the darkness. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its teeth were sharpened to points, and its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Jake fired the flare, and the figure vanished with an inhuman shriek. The pounding stopped, and for a moment, all was silent. But then the laughter returned, this time from all directions. At dawn, we decided to make a run for it. We packed what we could carry and headed for the ranger station several miles away. The trail was treacherous, and the shadows between the trees seemed to move with us. Halfway there, we were ambushed. One of the creatures lunged at Lily, grabbing her backpack. Jake swung a branch at it, and I tackled it to the ground. Up close, it smelled of rot and earth. Its strength was unnatural, far beyond what it should have been. We fought it off and kept running, but they were relentless. We stumbled onto a narrow cliffside path with the creatures closing in. Jake fired the flare gun again, and the light seemed to scare them off, but we knew it wouldn't last. We reached the ranger station just as night fell. The rangers didn't believe us, saying it was probably a bear attack or a group of pranksters. But when they saw the scratch marks on the RV and the pictures Lily had taken of the cave, their faces changed. One ranger, an older man, pulled me aside. "You shouldn't have gone to that part of the forest," he said quietly. "There are stories, people disappearing, strange sightings. Locals don't go there." We left the next morning, and I swore we'd never go camping again. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, how many others have they taken? How many more will vanish into the woods, leaving nothing but laughter behind? My name is Ella Morgan, and I'm 34 years old. Last fall, I took what I thought would be a peaceful RV trip through the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in Oregon. What I found instead still haunts me, and I'm writing this so that no one else makes the same mistake. It all started as a personal escape. My divorce had been finalized a few months earlier, and I needed something to pull me out of the haze I'd been living in. Photography had always been my passion, so I packed up my old Canon, filled my RV with enough supplies for a week, and hit the road. My plan was to photograph Oregon's landscapes and finally build the portfolio I'd been talking about for years. When I arrived at the ranger station, I met Bill, an older man with a grizzled beard and a no-nonsense demeanor. I asked him about lesser-known spots in the area. I didn't want touristy locations. I wanted untouched nature. "There's always Devil's Hollow," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. "Devil's Hollow?" I repeated, intrigued. "What's there?" "Nothing good," he replied, finally meeting my gaze. "Locals stay clear. If you're smart, you will too." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a scare tactic for inexperienced campers, but the name stuck in my head. By the time I left the station, I decided to see it for myself. After all, the best photographs come from the most remote places. The drive to Devil's Hollow was uneventful at first. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the dense trees. But the farther I went, the narrower the road became. My GPS started glitching, showing me off course even though I hadn't taken any wrong turns. I told myself it was just the lack of cell service. About an hour in, I saw someone standing by the roadside. A woman, young, maybe late 20s. She looked out of place, dressed in a thin jacket despite the crisp autumn air. She raised a hand as if to flag me down. Against my better judgment, I stopped. "Need a ride?" I called out, leaning out the window. She nodded and climbed into the passenger seat without a word. Her presence felt off. She didn't introduce herself, and when I asked her name, she paused before saying, "Miriam." "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just further in," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the drive was silent. I kept sneaking glances at her, but her expression never changed. It was as if she was deep in thought, or somewhere far away. When I reached a clearing in the hollow, Miriam was gone. I didn't hear the door open or close. She'd simply vanished. Her scarf was still draped over the passenger seat. I stepped out of the RV, scanning the area. "Miriam," I called, but the woods were silent. Shrugging it off as exhaustion, I set up camp. That evening, I wandered the area, camera in hand, capturing the way the fading light hit the trees. The forest was eerily quiet, with no birds or animals in sight. As night fell, I climbed into the RV, locked the door, and turned in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard my name. "Ella." I froze. The voice was soft and familiar. "Miriam." I peered out the window but saw nothing. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The forest loomed around me, silent and still. Then I saw them. Carvings on the trees surrounding my campsite. Symbols I couldn't decipher, sharp and deliberate like ancient runes. They hadn't been there earlier. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I found my camera still on the table where I'd left it. But when I flipped through the photos, my heart stopped. Every picture from the day before had changed. In each shot, a faint, shadowy figure stood in the background watching me. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe I'd captured an animal, and my mind was playing tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Determined to salvage the trip, I grabbed my gear and headed deeper into the forest. The trail twisted and turned in ways that didn't match the map. After hours of walking, I found myself back at the clearing where I'd started. Something was wrong. The forest seemed alive. The trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. And I started noticing strange patterns in the dirt. Circles, spirals, and lines that looked intentional. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to head back. That's when I saw her. Miriam stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at me. Her face was pale, her eyes glowing faintly. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice hollow and distant. "Where did you go?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why are you here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked into the woods. Against all logic, I followed. The trail led to a stone circle hidden deep in the hollow. In the center was an altar covered in moss and something dark. Blood, maybe. The air felt heavier here, like it was pressing down on me. Miriam stood by the altar, her expression blank. Then she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure materialized beside her, taller than any human, with horns that curved like a devil's. Its eyes burned red, and its voice echoed in my head rather than my ears. "You are not the first," it said. "You won't be the last." I stumbled back, my legs shaking. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. It laughed, a deep, guttural sound. "A bargain. Your most precious memory in exchange for freedom." My mind raced. I thought of my childhood, my parents, the love I'd once had. Could I really give any of that up? "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. The figure growled, and the forest erupted in chaos. The trees bent and twisted, their branches reaching for me. The ground beneath me shook, and the shadows lunged. I ran, camera swinging around my neck, the entity's laughter echoing behind me. The trail seemed to close in, looping endlessly. I fired the flash on my camera out of desperation, and, to my shock, the shadows recoiled. I used the flash again and again, carving a path through the darkness until I stumbled into sunlight. The moment I crossed into the light, the forest went still. The air felt lighter, and the whispers faded. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station. Bill was there, his face grim as I told him what had happened. He didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You made it out," he said. "Most don't." When I got home, I developed the photos from my camera. Every shot from that day showed the shadowy figure, growing clearer with each frame. In the final photo, it was standing directly behind me, its glowing eyes fixed on the back of my head. I don't know why I survived when others didn't, but I do know this: stay away from Devil's Hollow. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. My name is Ryan Bennett, and I'm 38 years old. What I'm about to share with you happened just a few months ago during a solo RV trip through the Opal Creek wilderness in Oregon. I went there to reconnect with history, to honor my sister's memory, and to chase my love of forgotten trails. Instead, I found something I can't fully explain, something that still chills me to the core. It all began as a way to deal with my grief. My sister, Emily, and I had always talked about exploring Oregon's historic trails, especially the old Santiam Wagon Road. It was one of those bucket list dreams we never got around to fulfilling before she passed. I thought this trip might help me find closure, maybe even bring me closer to her in some way. The old Santiam Wagon Road was a pioneer trail used in the 1800s, but much of it had been overtaken by wilderness over the years. I'd read about a section near Opal Creek called the Lost Trail, a rarely visited stretch that supposedly still held remnants of the past. It sounded perfect, remote, quiet, and full of history. When I arrived at the ranger station to check in, the man behind the desk, a grizzled guy named Bill, gave me a long look when I mentioned the Lost Trail. "Why that one?" he asked, frowning. "Most folks stick to the main paths." "I'm a history buff," I said. "I want to see what's left." He sighed, shaking his head. "It's rough out there. The trail's hard to follow, and people get turned around easy. You hear things out in those woods, things that make you question what's real." "Like what?" I asked, curious. He hesitated. "It's just old stories. Whispers, they call it. Travelers hearing voices, getting led off the path. Most don't come back." I smiled politely, thinking he was just trying to spook me. "I'll be careful." The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, though the road narrowed as I went deeper into the forest. My RV felt like a fortress on wheels, but even that didn't shake the growing unease in my chest. The trees seemed to close in, the sunlight dimming even though it was still mid-afternoon. When I parked and stepped out, the air was damp and cold. The forest was utterly silent. I spent the first couple of hours exploring the area around my campsite, camera in hand. There was something surreal about the moss-covered trees and crumbling wagon tracks I found along the trail. It felt like stepping back in time, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I'd hear a faint rustling, but when I turned, nothing was there. When I returned to the RV that evening, I was tired but satisfied. I had some great shots, including a few of an old wooden marker carved with initials. I cooked a quick meal, locked up the RV, and settled in for the night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something tapping on the side of the RV. At first, I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind, but when I sat up and listened, the tapping moved, around the back, then to the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The beam illuminated the trees, but nothing else. I tried to convince myself it was an animal and went back to bed, though it took me hours to fall asleep. The next morning, I set out on the Lost Trail, determined to follow it as far as I could. The map I'd printed was old and vague, but I figured I could rely on the terrain and landmarks to guide me. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. I found more remnants of the old wagon road, even what looked like the foundation of an old way station. Then I heard it, the first whisper. "Ryan." I froze, my heart pounding. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rustling leaves, but it was unmistakable. My name. I spun around, scanning the trees, but I was alone. "Just your mind playing tricks," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. But as I continued, the whispers grew louder. They weren't constant, just occasional bursts, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. About 2 miles in, I saw her. A woman in period clothing sat on a rock near a creek, her pale dress stark against the greenery. She looked up as I approached, her face calm but distant. "Hello," I called out cautiously. She smiled faintly. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was soft, almost musical, but her words sent a chill through me. "I'm just hiking," I said. "Are you lost?" She tilted her head, studying me. "I've been here a long time. I can show you the way, but you must stay on the path." "Who are you?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stood and began walking, motioning for me to follow. Against all logic, I did. Cassie led me deeper into the woods, pointing out old trail markers and landmarks I never would have noticed on my own. She spoke in riddles, mentioning the man who whispers and how he takes those who stray. Every time I pressed her for details, she deflected. The trail began to feel wrong. The trees seemed denser, the air colder. My GPS was useless, and even my compass spun erratically. I tried to memorize the path, but it felt like the forest was shifting around me. When we reached a clearing, Cassie stopped. "You'll need to go back now." "Back?" I asked, confused. "I thought you were showing me the trail." Her expression darkened. "He's coming? If you don't leave now, he'll take you too." Before I could respond, she vanished. I stood in the clearing, panic setting in as the whispers grew deafening. They no longer sounded like one voice, but many, overlapping and chaotic. Then, from the shadows, he emerged. The whispering man. He was impossibly tall, his body shrouded in darkness. His face was obscured, but his eyes burned like embers, and his mouth moved constantly, whispering words I couldn't understand. As he stepped closer, the whispers filled my head, dredging up memories of Emily, her laughter, her tears, her final moments in the hospital. "You can bring her back," the voices said, though I couldn't tell if it was him or my own mind. "Just follow." I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, you're not real." The whispering man reached out, his fingers elongating into shadowy tendrils. The trees around me bent toward him, their branches clawing at the sky. I turned and ran. The trail was unrecognizable, and every path seemed to loop back to the clearing. My breathing was ragged, my legs trembling, but I refused to stop. I clutched Emily's compass, the only thing keeping me grounded. Then I remembered my camera. Desperate, I fired the flash, and the light seemed to disrupt the shadows. The whispering man recoiled, his form flickering. I used the flash again and again, carving a path through the darkness until I stumbled onto the remnants of the wagon road. The whispers faded, and the forest grew still. Somehow, I'd made it back to my RV. When I returned to the ranger station, Bill looked at me with knowing eyes. I told him everything, and he nodded grimly. "Not many make it back," he said. "The whispering man doesn't like to lose." I left Opal Creek that day, vowing never to return. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that I left part of myself on that trail, and that the whispering man is still waiting for me to return. My name is Caleb Miller. I'm 32 years old, and this story happened to me in the fall of last year. I had just been fired from my job as a wildlife photographer at a major magazine. They said my work was uninspired, and honestly, they weren't wrong. I'd been on autopilot for years, taking the same kind of shots, playing it safe. So, when I lost my job, I decided to take my RV and drive to Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. I thought maybe I'd find something new there, something different, something to make me feel alive again. Instead, I found something I'll never forget. Crater Lake is one of those places that feels like it doesn't belong in this world. The water is impossibly blue, surrounded by jagged cliffs and towering pines. When I pulled up to the park, the air smelled crisp, clean, like pine needles and damp earth. I set up my RV in a secluded spot away from the main campsites, figuring I'd get some peace and quiet to focus on my work. As I drove in, I listened to a local radio station crackling through static. The DJ was telling some story about skinwalkers, evil shapeshifters from Navajo legends. He claimed they prowled the forests at night, mimicking voices to lure people into the woods. I laughed it off. Folklore. That's all it was. Or so I thought. I set up my tripod and spent the day taking photos of the lake and its surrounding cliffs. By the time I got back to my RV, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I cooked some ramen on my tiny stove, downloaded the day's shots to my laptop, and went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound, a soft tapping on the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was a tree branch swaying in the wind, but when I looked outside, the trees were still. No wind. No branches near enough to touch the RV. I went back to bed, convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning, I found footprints around the RV. They started out as animal tracks, large, like a wolf's, but halfway through they morphed into human footprints. Barefoot, they circled the RV before disappearing into the trees. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Later that day, I ran into a park ranger while I was hiking. Her name was Maggie. She was in her mid-20s with short brown hair and a face that looked older than it should have. She had that kind of intensity you see in people who've been through some things they don't want to talk about. "Not many people camp out here alone," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. "I like the quiet," I replied. "Good for photos." She hesitated, then said, "You should be careful. This land has stories. Strange things happen out here." "Like skinwalkers?" I joked. Her expression didn't change. "Just be careful." She gave me a small pouch of herbs and told me to burn it if I felt unsafe. I thought it was weird, but I took it. People are quirky. That night, things got worse. I was editing photos in the RV when I heard it again, tapping on the windows. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. "Hello?" I called. Silence. The flashlight beam swept over the trees, illuminating nothing but trunks and shadows. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name. "Caleb." It was my voice. I froze. The sound came from deep in the woods where no one else should have been. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the sound of my own voice, distorted, echoing back at me. When I turned to go back inside, I saw scratches on the RV's side. Deep gouges, as if made by claws. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, Maggie found me again while I was hiking. She looked even more tense than before. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "Whatever you've seen, whatever you've heard, it's not going to stop." "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Skinwalkers, or something like them. They take your voice, your face. They want you to follow them. And if you do, you're gone. Forever." It sounded insane, but the fear in her eyes was real. She handed me more herbs and told me to burn them as a last resort. That evening, I packed up to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and night was falling fast. I decided to wait until morning, but as darkness fell, the tapping returned. Louder this time, more insistent. Then came the voices. My voice, Maggie's voice, the hikers' voices, all calling me into the woods. When I refused to leave the RV, the figure appeared. It stood just outside the firelight, a grotesque, elongated version of me. Its limbs were too long, its skin too pale. Its face was almost mine, but wrong in subtle, horrifying ways. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, mimicking my movements, my voice. "Come out, Caleb," it said, smiling. I grabbed the herbs Maggie gave me and set them on fire. The smoke filled the air, acrid and sharp, and the creature recoiled, its face twisting in rage. "You can't run forever," it hissed in my voice before vanishing into the trees. At first light, I abandoned the RV and hiked to the nearest town. When I got there, I told the locals what had happened. They didn't seem surprised. "Things like that have been happening here for years," one of them said. I went to the ranger station to thank Maggie, but when I asked for her, the ranger on duty looked confused. "There's no Maggie here," he said. "Hasn't been for years." I left Oregon the next day, and I haven't been back since. A week later, I developed the photos from that trip. In every shot, there it was, standing in the background, watching me. I still don't know what it wanted or why it let me go, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear it. My voice, calling me back. And I know one thing for sure, I'm never going back to Crater Lake. My name is Eva Reyes. I'm 29 years old, and I write a travel blog called Wander Eva. This story happened last October when I was chasing inspiration deep in Oregon's Siaslaw National Forest. I thought I was searching for the next great idea, something to pull me out of my creative rut. Instead, I found something that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It all started with a tip from an old hiker I met at a coffee shop in Eugene. He told me about a place called the Whispering Grove, a secluded area deep in the forest that supposedly inspired vivid dreams and creativity. According to him, it wasn't on any map, but if I followed the old logging trails far enough, I'd find it. "But be careful," he added, his voice low. "The place has a dark history." I laughed it off. A dark history was exactly what I needed for my next blog post, or maybe even my first novel. I pulled into a small rundown RV park on the edge of the Siaslaw National Forest just before sunset. The trees loomed like sentinels, their shadows stretching long over the cracked pavement. My RV, a beat-up but reliable white and blue rig, fit right in with the place. I was greeted by a couple camping nearby, Caleb and June. They seemed like your typical middle-aged outdoor enthusiasts, though their gear suggested they were more serious about it than most. June was bubbly and talkative, the kind of person who could make friends with a rock. Caleb, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. "What brings you out here?" Caleb asked as we stood by the fire they'd built. "I'm a travel blogger," I explained, sipping the cup of coffee they'd offered me. "Heard there's a place out here called the Whispering Grove. Ever heard of it?" Their smiles faltered. June's eyes darted to Caleb, who set his cup down and leaned forward. "We've heard of it," he said, his voice low, "but you should stay away from there. People who go there don't always come back." June added, "It's not just a story, Ava. The place is cursed." I nodded politely, but inwardly I was thrilled. A cursed forest? Disappearances? It was perfect blog material. The next morning, I set out with my hiking boots, camera, and a notebook. My RV was parked as close to the trailhead as I could manage, and I followed the old logging markers into the forest. The air was crisp and cool, and the earthy smell of pine filled my lungs. After a few hours, I found the first signs of the sawmill the hiker had mentioned. Rusted machinery lay scattered among the trees, overgrown with moss and vines. Strange carvings covered the trunks nearby. Spirals, handprints, and jagged symbols I didn't recognize. Something about the place felt off. The air was heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. But I shrugged it off. Forests can be creepy, especially when you're alone. As I ventured deeper, the trees began to close in, their branches tangling above me to block out the sunlight. I started hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, like the murmur of distant voices. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. Just the wind, I muttered to myself. By late afternoon, I found it, the Whispering Grove, a clearing surrounded by massive, gnarled trees. The ground was soft with moss, and the air smelled faintly of pine and something metallic, like blood. I pulled out my camera and started snapping pictures, my excitement overshadowing my unease. Back at the RV, I downloaded the photos to my laptop. They were stunning. Moody shots of the grove that practically radiated mystery. For the first time in months, I felt inspired. That night, as I tried to write, the whispers returned. This time, they were closer, louder. They seemed to come from just outside the RV. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. The trees stood silent, their shadows long and dark. I shivered and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then I noticed the carvings. The symbols I'd seen on the trees near the sawmill were scratched into the side of my RV. The next morning, I found Caleb and June near their campsite. June's face paled when she saw the carvings on my RV. "You went to the grove, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I admitted. "What's the big deal?" Caleb sighed heavily. "The grove is cursed. It's tied to something that happened a long time ago. Loggers desecrated an indigenous burial ground out there, and ever since, people who disturb the grove, they're marked." "Marked?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "The spirits don't like to be disturbed," June said. "They'll try to scare you away at first, but if you stay too long—" She trailed off, her eyes darting to Caleb. I didn't believe them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Determined to prove them wrong, or right, I returned to the grove. This time, I brought a journal and started sketching the carvings, hoping to decipher their meaning. As I worked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just random murmurs now, they were voices. "Leave," they said. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced as I packed up my things and hurried back to the RV. That night, the dream started. I saw shadowy figures dragging logs through the forest, their faces obscured by darkness. There were screams, distant but chilling, and the smell of smoke and blood filled the air. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The next morning, June suggested performing a séance. "If you want answers, we might be able to communicate with the spirits," she said. Caleb was against it, but I agreed. I wanted to know what was happening. We gathered near the grove that evening. June set up candles and incense, muttering prayers I didn't recognize. As the sun set, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. Suddenly, I saw them. Figures made of smoke and ash emerging from the trees. Their faces were twisted masks of anger and pain. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them hissed, its voice like the rustle of leaves. I froze as the ground beneath us began to tremble, roots snaking out of the earth like grasping fingers. Caleb pulled me back as a massive tree branch crashed to the ground where I'd been standing. "Run!" he shouted. As we fled, I realized what I had to do. The spirits were bound to the grove by the old logging tools scattered there, tools used to desecrate the burial ground. I remembered the rusted saw I'd seen embedded in one of the trees and sprinted back to the grove, ignoring Caleb and June's shouts. The saw was heavy and rusted, but I wrenched it free. The spirits screamed, their voices blending into a deafening roar as the grove came alive, branches lashing out and the ground shaking violently. With Caleb and June's help, I carried the saw and the bones I'd found earlier to a clearing. We burned them together, saying whatever prayers June could think of. The air grew still. The whispers stopped. The spirits were gone. I left the forest the next morning, shaken but alive. Caleb and June stayed behind, determined to document the grove's history and warn others. As for me, I wrote about my experience, not on my blog, but in a novel that became my greatest success. I'll never forget what happened in the Whispering Grove, and I'll never go back. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Jackson Mercer, but most people call me Jack. I'm 36 years old, and I've been traveling solo in my RV for the better part of the last year. This happened last October, just a few months after my dad passed away. I needed a break from reality, something to take my mind off the empty house, the boxes of his things, and the weight of memories. That's how I ended up at the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area, a place I'd read about online. It seemed like the perfect spot. Miles of rolling sand, a rugged coastline, and most importantly, a history of shipwrecks. Dad and I were both obsessed with history and metal detecting, and this trip felt like a way to honor him. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Looking back, I realize I should have left the dunes the first night. But sometimes, the things that seem harmless at first glance are the ones that haunt you the most. The RV park was smaller than I expected. A gravel lot with a few electrical hookups and a tiny office that doubled as a gift shop. I parked at the far end, away from the handful of other campers. The ocean was just visible beyond the dunes, the wind carrying the faint smell of salt water. I spent that first day setting up and taking my metal detector for a spin near the beach. I found a few coins, a rusted fishing hook, and a broken piece of what might have been a belt buckle. Nothing special, but it was enough to keep me going. That evening, I wandered into town and stumbled across a little museum dedicated to local maritime history. Inside, a display case held artifacts from shipwrecks, barnacle-covered bells, old compasses, even a few pieces of jewelry. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Ellie Parker, the museum's curator. "Let me guess," she said with a smirk. "Treasure hunter?" "Something like that," I replied, and we got to talking. She told me about the shipwrecks along the coast and warned me not to dig too deeply, especially near the dunes. "Why not?" I asked, curious. Her smile faded. "People say the dunes are haunted. Something about the sailors who died in the wrecks. They don't like to be disturbed." I laughed it off, but Ellie didn't. "Be careful, Jack," she said as I left. "Sometimes things buried in the sand are better left that way." The next morning, I set out early, map and metal detector in hand. My goal was to find remnants of an old shipwreck called the Silver Dawn, rumored to be buried beneath the dunes. The wind whipped across the sand as I followed faint logging roads and paths until I found a stretch of untouched dunes. Hours passed as I searched. My metal detector beeped here and there, but it was just junk. Cans, nails, and the occasional coin. Then, just as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I hit something big. I dug for what felt like forever, the sand sliding back into the hole faster than I could clear it. Finally, I unearthed a massive piece of wood. A section of a ship's mast, blackened and worn smooth by time. Nearby, I found what looked like part of a figurehead, the carved torso of a woman, her face weathered but haunting, with empty eyes that seemed to watch me. Excitement surged through me. This was it, real history. But as I packed up to leave, I heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the sound of the dunes shifting, but then it came again, clearer this time. My name. Jack. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there, just the dunes and the endless horizon. I told myself it was the wind and headed back to my RV. That night, things got stranger. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I felt the RV shake, just slightly, like someone had bumped into it. Then I heard it, soft tapping on the window. I sat up, every nerve on edge. "Hello?" I called, but the only answer was the wind. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I saw them. Wet, sandy footprints leading away from the RV, disappearing into the dunes. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I went back the next day. Curiosity and pride outweighed my fear. I couldn't leave without knowing what else was buried out there. This time, I found a chest. It was small and rotted, the hinges rusted shut, but it was unmistakably from a ship. My heart pounded as I pried it open with a rock. Inside were tarnished coins, fragments of jewelry, and a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and brittle. I didn't dare read the diary there. I stuffed everything into my bag and hurried back to the RV, eager to examine my findings in safety. That night, the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable. The whispers started again, louder and more insistent. And then I saw them. Figures moving through the mist, their shapes blurry but unmistakably human. They surrounded the RV, pressing their hollow eyes against the windows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were staring directly at me. The next morning, I drove into town and found Ellie at the museum. I showed her the coins and the diary, half expecting her to be as excited as I was. Instead, her face paled. "You need to put this back," she said, her voice shaking. "These sailors, they're not just ghosts. They're angry. They were raiders, Jack. They looted villages and desecrated graves, and they died in a storm as punishment. They don't rest because they know they deserve what happened." "I can't just put it back," I argued. "This is history. It's important." "Some history isn't meant to be uncovered," she replied. "If you keep this, they'll come for you." That night, I read the diary. It told the story of the Silver Dawn and its crew, their greed, their crimes, and their final moments, as the ship was torn apart by the storm. The last entry was scrawled and barely legible, but one line stood out. "The sea will not forgive us, nor will the sand." As I closed the book, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The RV began to shake violently, and the windows fogged with the condensation. Outside, the figures gathered again, their forms more distinct this time. They were sailors, their bodies waterlogged and broken, their hollow eyes staring accusingly. "Thief," they whispered, their voices like the rustle of dead leaves. "Give it back." I grabbed the chest and ran. The wind howled around me as I stumbled through the dunes, the spirits following close behind. Their whispers grew to a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts. At the wreck site, I buried the chest beneath the figurehead, my hands shaking. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew still. When I looked up, the spirits were gone. The next morning, I packed up and left without looking back. I didn't tell Ellie what had happened, but I think she knew. The Oregon dunes are beautiful, but I'll never go back. Some things are better left buried, and some ghosts will never forgive. My name is Claire Walker, and I was 32 when this happened. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I don't scare easily. But what I experienced deep in the Opal Creek wilderness changed me. I've stopped trying to explain it logically. I can't. It was late September, during the last few warm days before the rain set in. I was leading a small group into the wilderness: Max, Rachel, and my younger brother Kyle. What we thought would be a fun, productive adventure turned into something I can only describe as a nightmare. It started as a simple research trip. I'd been tipped off about a rare species of salamander rumored to live near Opal Creek. The area, dotted with relics of Oregon's mining past, had always intrigued me. My photographer friend Rachel wanted to tag along to capture the landscape's raw beauty. Max, a self-styled survivalist, offered his expertise, though I knew he was mostly in it for the thrill. Kyle joined at the last minute, claiming he needed a break from screens. I was skeptical, but I wanted him to get out of the house. We set off early, the morning fog clinging to the trees as we hiked past Jawbone Flats, an old mining town turned ghostly with decay. The trail was well marked, the air crisp and spirits high. Max kept bragging about his navigation skills, pointing out alternate paths and shortcuts while Rachel stopped every few minutes to snap photos of moss-covered rocks and sparkling pools. The first sign of trouble came from Kyle. His boots, new and too stiff, were rubbing his heels raw. By midday, he was limping, and Max grew impatient. "We don't have all day, man," Max said, his voice sharp. "You should have broken those in first." "I didn't plan on coming, remember?" Kyle shot back, his face red with frustration. I tried to keep the peace, offering to adjust our pace, but tension simmered between them. By late afternoon, Max convinced us to veer off the main trail, claiming he knew a faster route to a good camping spot. Against my better judgment, I relented. The forest grew denser, the air cooler. Shadows stretched long as we wound through unmarked paths. That's when Rachel noticed the carvings. "Look at this," she said, running her fingers over a tree trunk. Deep gouges formed crude human-like figures with long limbs and hollow eyes. "Creepy, huh?" "Probably old miners trying to scare each other," Max said with a dismissive wave. "Or scare off outsiders," Rachel murmured, snapping a photo. We reached a small clearing near dusk. The area felt wrong, too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. But the approaching darkness left us little choice. As we pitched our tents, the wind picked up, carrying faint whispers that I chalked up to rustling leaves. Then Rachel found the relics. "Claire, come see this," she called, crouching near a cluster of rocks. She'd uncovered a rusted pickaxe, its handle splintered, and a pile of old boots, their leather warped and brittle. Nearby, a circle of stones formed what looked like a fire pit, though it hadn't been used in decades. "Miners must have left it," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Something about the scene unnerved me. The boots were arranged too deliberately, toes all pointing inward. We ate dinner quickly, and I climbed into my tent exhausted. But sleep didn't come easily. Just as I started to drift off, I heard a voice. Faint, distant, yet unmistakable. "Claire." I bolted upright, heart pounding. I unzipped my tent and peered into the darkness. The campfire had burned low, casting flickering shadows. Max snored loudly in his tent, but Rachel sat cross-legged by the embers staring into the trees. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, stepping closer. She nodded slowly. "It sounded like you." The next morning, Kyle was in a foul mood. He claimed he hadn't slept, kept awake by what he described as something walking around the tents. I noticed his pallor, the dark circles under his eyes. "Probably a deer," Max said. "Nothing to freak out about." But I wasn't so sure. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. We packed up and continued deeper into the wilderness, hoping to find the salamanders I'd come for. Max insisted on leading, taking us further off course. By midday, the trail had disappeared entirely, and the map Max had brought proved useless. "We're not lost," Max insisted, though his confidence wavered. "We just need to loop back." "That's what lost people say," Kyle muttered. As we argued, Rachel wandered off. When she returned, her face was pale. "You need to see this." She led us to a clearing where the ground was littered with bones. Animal, I told myself, though they seemed too clean, too arranged. In the center stood a crude wooden totem, its surface blackened as if burned. The carvings matched the ones we'd seen earlier, twisted, human-like figures. "Okay, that's messed up," Kyle said, stepping back. "We should leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Now." But leaving wasn't so simple. The storm hit that afternoon, sudden and violent. Rain turned the ground to mud, and the wind howled through the trees, drowning out our voices. We set up camp hastily, this time near the entrance to an old mine shaft Rachel had spotted. As night fell, the whispers returned. Louder this time, circling the camp like predators. I huddled in my tent, clutching my flashlight. Then Kyle screamed. I scrambled outside, slipping in the mud. His tent was empty, the flap torn open. The flashlight beam caught movement. Kyle's boot, half buried in the muck, leading toward the mine. "Stay here," Max barked, grabbing a hunting knife from his pack. He ran toward the mine, and I had no choice but to follow. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with decay. Our flashlights illuminated rusted tracks and broken tools. Deeper in, we found Kyle, or what was left of him. His body was slumped against the wall, his face frozen in terror. But it was the carvings around him that sent a chill through me. They covered the walls, glowing faintly in the dark. Then we heard it. A scraping sound followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. A figure emerged from the shadows, gaunt, pale, with limbs too long for its body. Its eyes glowed, unblinking. "Run," Max whispered, but it was too late. The creature lunged, its movements jerky but fast. Max shoved me aside, slashing at it with his knife. It didn't bleed, it shrieked. A sound so piercing it rattled my skull. Max screamed as the creature pounced, its claws tearing into him. I ran, stumbling through the dark until I burst out of the mine. Rachel was waiting, her face wet with tears. "Where's Kyle? Where's Max?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. I grabbed her arm, dragging her away. We didn't stop until dawn. The storm had passed, but the forest was eerily still. Rachel pulled out her camera, insisting we retrace our steps to find the main trail. That's when she froze, staring at the screen. "What is it?" I asked. She turned it toward me. The photos she'd taken earlier showed faint humanoid shapes lurking in the background, watching us. "We have to go," I said, my voice shaking. But the forest didn't want us to leave. Every path we took looped back to the mine. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. Rachel clutched the camera like a talisman, but it didn't protect her. That night, I woke to find her tent empty, the camera lying outside. I was alone. I don't remember much about the final hours. I ran blindly until the forest thinned and I stumbled onto the main trail. Rangers found me the next morning, disheveled and incoherent. They didn't believe me, of course. No one does. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I hear Kyle's voice, faint, distant, calling my name. I haven't gone back to Opal Creek. I never will. My name is Leah Daniels, and I was 38 when this happened. I've spent years traveling alone in my RV, documenting the most beautiful, remote places I can find. Solitude doesn't bother me. It's why I left my old life behind. But something about my time at Hart Mountain National Antelope Refuge still keeps me up at night. I don't think I'll ever truly understand what I saw out there, or why I made it out alive. It was late September when I arrived at the refuge. The desert air was dry, crisp, and eerily still. I'd heard about the place from other travelers. A rugged, isolated gem with hot springs, endless vistas, and some of the darkest skies in Oregon. perfect for my blog and for clearing my head. I planned to spend a week hiking, soaking, and writing. The drive-in was uneventful. My RV, an aging Class B I lovingly called Bluebird, handled the bumpy dirt roads better than I expected. I parked near a trailhead at the base of a rocky ridge, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and silence. No other vehicles, no signs of life. Just me and the desert. That first night was peaceful. The stars were dazzling, like pinpricks of ice in the black sky. I sat outside with a cup of tea, letting the stillness seep into my bones. It felt good to be alone. The second night, things started to change. It began with the lights. I'd just finished dinner and was jotting notes in my journal when I noticed them. Faint, flickering orbs hovering in the distance, over the hills. At first, I thought they were distant headlights, maybe from an off-road vehicle. But the way they moved wasn't natural. They darted, stopped, then floated upward, as if they were searching for something. I grabbed my camera, hoping to capture the phenomenon, but the moment I focused the lens, the lights blinked out. Strange, I thought, but nothing to lose sleep over. I brushed it off and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to hike to one of the nearby hot springs. The trail was faint, barely more than a suggestion cutting through the scrub. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, its beauty stark and unforgiving. I felt small out there, but I liked that. About halfway to the spring, I found something odd. Carved into a flat rock at the side of the trail were words, "Leave now." The letters were jagged, weathered, but unmistakable. I crouched to get a better look, running my fingers over the grooves. Probably a prank, I thought, a bored camper or hiker trying to scare people off. Still, it left me unsettled. I snapped a photo and moved on. The hot spring was empty, the water steaming gently under the sun. I stripped down and slid in, letting the warmth soak into my muscles. For a while, I felt normal again, even calm. But then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, faint murmurs just on the edge of hearing, but the more I listened, the more distinct they became. Voices, low and rhythmic, like chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I whipped around, scanning the horizon. No one, just the desert, stretching out in every direction. My heart pounded as I quickly got out of the water, dried off, and dressed. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Back at my RV, I tried to shake off the experience. I distracted myself by reviewing the photos I'd taken that day. The carved rock stood out, and I zoomed in on the image, hoping to see something I'd missed. That's when I noticed the shadow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. An elongated figure standing just behind the rock. I hadn't seen anyone when I was there, and the angle didn't make sense. My hands shook as I closed my laptop. Night fell, and with it came the lights again. This time, they were closer. I stood outside the RV, staring at them as they danced across the ridge, moving in ways that defied explanation. They seemed alive, purposeful. A chill ran down my spine as a thought struck me. They weren't random. They were coming toward me. The next morning, Bluebird wouldn't start. I turned the key, and the engine had sputtered and died. I checked the battery, the fuel lines, anything I could think of, but nothing worked. Frustrated and uneasy, I decided to hike to a nearby ridge to try my emergency beacon. The higher ground might help with the signal. The hike was harder than I expected. The terrain was steep and uneven, and I slipped, twisting my ankle. Pain shot through me, but I pushed on, driven by a growing sense of urgency I couldn't explain. It felt like the desert was watching me, waiting. At the top of the ridge, I found something that stopped me cold. An old stone altar, weathered and crumbling, stood at the center of a small clearing. Around it were scattered bones, animal, I hoped, and other strange objects. Feathers, charred wood, and what looked like rusted jewelry. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest. The whispers returned, louder now, almost insistent. I stepped closer, drawn to the altar despite every instinct screaming at me to leave. That's when I saw it. Carved into the altar were more words. "You are not welcome." I stumbled back, my ankle throbbing. The lights appeared again, surrounding the clearing this time, pulsating with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Shadowy forms began to emerge from the edges of my vision, tall, thin, and wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they didn't belong in this world. Panic surged through me as I realized the shadows were closing in. I fumbled with my emergency beacon, pressing the button with trembling hands. But the device didn't respond. It was dead, like everything else. The lights grew brighter, the shadows closer. The whispers turned to voices, distinct and angry, though I still couldn't understand the words. I dropped to my knees, desperate, and placed my journal and survival knife on the altar. A peace offering, or maybe a plea. The lights paused, flickering uncertainly. The shadows stopped advancing, their forms wavering like smoke. For a moment, the desert was still again, and then they vanished. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. Somehow, the engine started, and I drove until the refuge was far behind me. I haven't returned since. Months later, I published a blog post about the trip, leaving out the supernatural details. I framed the experience as a cautionary tale about respecting the land and its history. A week after the post went live, I received an email. It was from another traveler, someone who had visited Hart Mountain. They claimed to have seen my journal on the altar, untouched, along with new carvings in the rock. You were spared. To this day, I don't know why. My name is Derek Price. I'm 35 years old, and what happened to me last year in Malheur National Forest still feels like a nightmare. I've spent most of my life outdoors, guiding hikes and camping in some of the most rugged places in the country. I thought I'd seen everything nature had to offer. I was wrong. This trip was supposed to be my escape. After my divorce and a rough patch at work, I needed time alone to reconnect with what I loved, the wilderness. So I packed up my old RV, loaded with enough supplies for a week, and drove out to Malheur National Forest in eastern Oregon. I'd heard it was remote, beautiful, and quiet, exactly what I needed. I set up camp at a secluded site near Strawberry Mountain, a place far enough from the main trails that I wouldn't run into anyone, or so I thought. The first day went smoothly. I hiked along the creek, fished for trout, and even managed to snap a few photos of a bald eagle perched in the distance. By evening, I was settled by a campfire, enjoying the kind of peaceful solitude I hadn't felt in months. That's when I met Tom. He was an older man, wiry and weathered, with a prospector's pick slung over one shoulder. He'd appeared from the woods without a sound, as if the forest had spit him out. "Evenin'," he said, tipping his hat. "Evening," I replied cautiously. "You're a long way out here. Not many folks come this deep." "That's the idea," I said with a small smile. Tom didn't smile back. He leaned on his pick and squinted at me. "You be careful. Mist rolls in here sometimes. Ain't natural." "Mist?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, it moves like it's alive. Eats up everything it touches." He stared at the fire for a long moment, then added, "Best pack up and head out in the morning. Just a friendly warning." I wanted to ask more, but before I could, he tipped his hat again and disappeared into the trees. His words stayed with me, though I chalked it up to local superstition. Every place had its ghost stories, and this one was no different. The next morning, I woke to a strange silence. The birdsong I'd heard the day before was gone. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. As I brewed coffee, I noticed something unusual. Patches of grass around the campsite had turned brown overnight, as if scorched. The trees looked fine, but the ground felt spongy, like it was decaying beneath my boots. I shrugged it off, blaming some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. Still, a knot of unease settled in my stomach. That afternoon, I hiked deeper into the forest to fish at a larger stream. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Several times, I turned around. Sure, I'd seen movement in the trees, but there was nothing there. Then I found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least it had been. Its body was shriveled, its skin stretched tight over its bones like a deflated balloon. The eyes were gone, and the flesh looked brittle, as if it had been drained of all moisture. I backed away, my pulse pounding. I'd seen predator kills before, but this wasn't natural. That night, the mist came. I was sitting in the RV, reviewing the photos I'd taken, when I noticed it creeping through the trees. It was thick, white, and seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. At first, I thought it was just fog, but as it rolled closer, I felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath fogged in front of me, even inside the RV. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like wind rustling through leaves, but soon I realized they were words, voices. They were calling my name, Derek. My chest tightened as I peered out the window. The mist was surrounding the RV now, swirling like a living thing. Shadows moved within it, human-shaped but wrong. They were too thin, their limbs too long. One of them pressed against the window, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow black pits. "Come out," it whispered, its voice muffled by the glass. "Join us." I stumbled back, my heart racing. Grabbing my flashlight and knife, I bolted the RV door and tried to convince myself this wasn't happening, but the mist didn't leave. It circled the RV all night, whispering and pressing against the windows. When dawn broke, the mist was gone, but the forest felt wrong. The trees seemed darker, their branches twisted. The ground was littered with more dead patches, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I decided to leave. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. My phone had no signal, and even the emergency radio I carried emitted nothing but static. Panic set in as the mist began creeping back, this time faster. It moved like water flooding the forest floor, swallowing everything in its path. I tried running, but the mist was everywhere, cutting off the trails. The whispers returned, louder now, mocking me. I heard voices from my past, my ex-wife's angry words, the disappointed tone of my old boss. The mist knew my fears, my regrets, and it used them against me. In a moment of clarity, I remembered Tom's warning. Fire. Rushing back to the RV, I grabbed the canister of gasoline I used for my generator and began pouring it around the campsite. When the mist came close enough that I could feel its cold breath, I lit a match. The flames roared to life, creating a barrier between me and the mist. For a moment, I thought I'd won. But then I saw them. Skeletons, human and animal, scattered in the firelight. The mist had consumed countless lives before mine. And it wasn't done yet. The fire bought me time, but the mist wasn't gone. It seethed beyond the flames, waiting. Grabbing the keys, I tried the RV one last time. Miraculously, it sputtered to life. I drove like a madman, the mist chasing me through the forest. The road seemed endless, stretching on forever as if the forest itself was trying to trap me. Finally, I burst onto the highway. The mist stopped abruptly, retreating into the trees as if bound to the forest. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I haven't been back to Malheur since. I don't think I ever will, but sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a faint glow in the distance, like mist creeping through the trees. I tell myself it's my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. The mist is still out there, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander into its grasp. My name is Rachel Connors. I'm 27 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened last October. I just graduated from college, finally free of assignments and deadlines. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. A solo road trip across the Pacific Northwest in my refurbished RV. My plan was to capture the beauty of nature through my camera lens and leave behind the stress of my breakup and the chaos of my life. But instead, I found myself trapped in something I still can't explain. It all started when I decided to camp at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon. The park was stunning, known for its picturesque waterfalls and endless hiking trails. I arrived early on a crisp Friday morning, eager to park my RV in a quiet remote spot near the North Falls trailhead. I wanted solitude, and I got it. Too much of it. As I pulled into the park, I saw a man waving from the visitor center. He wore a park volunteer badge, his uniform slightly rumpled. His name tag read Will. "You must be new around here," he said, squinting at me in the sunlight. "Just passing through," I replied. "I'm staying at the North Falls campsite for the weekend." His expression shifted. "You're camping alone?" "Yeah, why?" Will hesitated, glancing toward the trees. "North Falls is fine. Just be careful. Stick to the marked trails, and whatever you do, don't wander after dark." "Why not?" "It's not safe," he said simply. Before I could press him for details, he added, "If you hear anything strange, just ignore it. Don't go looking for trouble." I shrugged off his cryptic warning. Locals loved their spooky campfire stories, and I figured he was just trying to scare me. I thanked him, got back into my RV, and drove to my campsite. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, grabbed my camera, and set out to explore the park. The waterfalls were breathtaking. The sound of rushing water drowned out every other noise, and the mist created rainbows in the sunlight. I snapped photo after photo, completely in my element. By mid-afternoon, I decided to hike a bit farther, ignoring the faint, trail-closed sign near North Falls. I told myself it was just a precaution for tourists who didn't know their way around. The trail led me to a clearing where I found something odd. A rusted tricycle, half buried in the dirt. Nearby, a tree trunk was covered in carvings, names and dates scratched into the bark. Some were recent, but others were so old they'd almost faded away. I felt a strange chill and snapped a few photos before heading back. That night, as I sat in my RV editing pictures, I noticed something unsettling. In several of the shots near the falls, there were faint, blurry shapes in the background. They looked like children, standing motionless in the mist. I frowned, chalking it up to water droplets on my lens. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The second night was when things started to spiral. I woke to the sound of laughter. Soft, high-pitched, like children playing tag. My heart raced as I sat up and peered through the RV window. The campsite was empty. "Hello?" I called, stepping outside with my flashlight. The laughter stopped. The air was cold, too cold for an October night. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I noticed something strange. Tiny, muddy footprints led from the forest to my RV door. My stomach twisted as I stared at them. They couldn't have been there the night before. Later that day, I ran into Will again at the visitor center. I told him about the noises and the footprints. He looked pale. "You should leave," he said quietly. "What's going on, Will? What's out there?" He sighed, leaning closer as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Years ago, there was an accident, a school trip. A group of kids drowned at North Falls. Their bodies were never recovered. Since then, strange things have happened in that area. People say the kids' spirits are still out there, trying to lure others into the water." I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or feel terrified. "You can't be serious." He didn't smile. "Rachel, I'm serious. Get out while you still can." Despite his warning, I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to see it for myself, had to understand what was happening. That afternoon, I hiked back to North Falls, my camera in hand. The falls were beautiful but eerie. The mist hung heavier than before, muffling every sound. As I approached the water, I saw them. Faint shapes moving through the fog. Children, their outlines shimmering like heat waves. My breath caught. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. They turned toward me, their faces pale and expressionless. One of them stepped closer, pointing at the water. "Come play," a voice whispered, though the child's mouth didn't move. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my camera. My legs felt heavy, as if something were pulling me forward. The edge of the falls loomed closer. "Rachel!" a voice shouted. I snapped out of the trance and turned to see Will running toward me. He grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the water's edge. The children vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. Back at the RV, I was shaking. Will stayed with me, his face grim. "They don't let go easily," he said. "Once they've chosen you, they'll keep trying to pull you back." The night was worse than anything I'd experienced. My RV lights flickered. The radio turned on by itself, playing a haunting melody that sounded like a lullaby. The windows fogged up, and tiny handprints appeared on the glass. I tried to ignore it, but then the laughter started again. It came from all directions, growing louder and more frenzied. "What do they want?" I whispered. Will's voice was steady. "To take you. They want you to stay with them forever." He handed me a small box filled with trinkets, coins, toys, and a few old photographs. "Leave them an offering," he said. "It might appease them long enough for you to get away." At dawn, I returned to North Falls with the box in hand. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. I placed the offering near the water's edge and whispered, "This is for you. Please let me go." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew warmer, and the shadows and the mist seemed to recede. I didn't wait to see if it worked. I ran back to my RV, started the engine, and didn't look back. It's been months since that trip, but I still can't sleep without checking the locks on my RV. Sometimes I hear faint laughter in the distance, even when I'm miles away from Silver Falls. The worst part? A week after I left, I developed the photos from that day. In one of them, I saw the children standing by the falls. They were smiling. And standing among them was me. My name is Blake Tanner. I'm 32 years old, and this happened in October of last year. I thought I was prepared for anything. I've spent years honing my survival skills, living off the grid in an old RV I bought cheap from a guy on Craigslist. It wasn't much to look at, but it was reliable, until it wasn't. Until everything I knew, everything I trusted, began to unravel in the forests around Mount Hood. It started like any other trip. I'd parked my RV deep into a little used trail off Lolo Pass Road. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by towering firs and maples shedding their red and gold leaves. The kind of place where you could breathe clean air and feel the weight of the world lift from your shoulders. At least, that's what I told myself. I was there to test my skills, to live completely off the land for 2 weeks. No contact with the outside world, just me, nature, and the simple challenge of survival. I'd been set up for a day when the first person I'd seen since arriving approached. She wore the uniform of a park ranger, her auburn hair tied back under her cap, and she had a kind but wary expression. "Hey," she called out as she stepped into view. "Name's Megan Hayes. You out here alone?" "Yeah," I replied, leaning against the doorframe of my RV. "Just me. I like the quiet." "Well, you've got plenty of that out here," she said with a small laugh, though her eyes darted around as if scanning the tree line. "Listen, I don't want to scare you, but this area's special. Local legends say there's something in these woods, something dangerous." "What, like bears?" I joked, though her tone was unsettling. She shook her head. "Worse. Stories about people who got too hungry, too desperate, and turned into something not human. Wendigo, they call it." "Wendigo?" I repeated, amused but uneasy. "Sounds like campfire stories." "Maybe," she said, shrugging. "Just keep your wits about you, okay?" I nodded, thanked her for the warning, and watched as she walked back toward her vehicle. I didn't think much of her words at the time, chalking it up to local folklore. But that night as I lay in my RV, the first strange sound came. It was faint at first, a soft, high-pitched whimper, like a child crying in the distance. I sat up, heart pounding. No one was supposed to be out here. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the woods. "Hello," I called. The crying stopped. The silence was absolute, so thick it made my ears ring. I stood there for a long time waiting for something, anything, to move. When nothing did, I shook it off and went back inside. The next morning, I found the marks. They were claw marks, deep and jagged, scratched into the side of my RV. 3 long slashes like the kind you'd see in a horror movie. My stomach turned as I crouched to examine them. Too big for any animal I'd ever encountered. Definitely not human. That wasn't all. On the door, barely visible in the morning light, were muddy handprints. Small ones, like a child's. I swallowed hard, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a prank, a lost hiker. The rationalizations felt thin. I decided to focus on the task at hand, gathering food and water. About half a mile from the RV, I stumbled upon a stream. But instead of feeling relieved, my skin crawled. There were bones everywhere. A small clearing by the water was littered with them, cracked and scattered like someone, or something, had been feasting there. I saw the skull of a deer, its antlers snapped clean off. Nearby, a human femur rested, half buried in the dirt. I turned and sprinted back to the RV, adrenaline pumping. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. That night, the noises returned. Scratches on the walls, heavy footsteps circling the RV. I held my hunting knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other, my breath shallow and quick. I shouted, "Who's out there? Show yourself." The only answer was silence. When the footsteps stopped, I felt a surge of relief, until I turned and saw the window. Something was pressed against the glass, watching me. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with sunken black eyes that seemed too large for its skull. Its lips curled into a grotesque grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and sharp. I screamed and swung the flashlight toward it, but by the time the beam hit the window, it was gone. The next morning, Megan returned. She knocked on the RV door, startling me. I opened it to find her standing there, her face pale and serious. "I need you to leave," she said, skipping the pleasantries. Now. What's going on? I demanded. I don't have time to explain, just trust me. This isn't a place you want to stay. Before I could answer, the sound of snapping branches filled the air. Megan and I both turned toward the woods. Standing there, just barely visible between the trees, was the figure. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs stretched and unnatural. It moved toward us with jerky, animalistic motions. "Get inside!" Megan shouted, drawing her sidearm. We slammed the door shut and locked it. The RV shook as the creature circled it, its claws scraping against the metal walls. Megan fired a shot through the window, and the thing let out a piercing screech before retreating into the woods. Megan didn't wait for me to argue. She pulled out her radio and tried to call for backup, but it was dead. No signal. "We're on our own," she said grimly. "Do you have weapons? Gasoline?" I nodded and grabbed a canister from the storage compartment. Megan explained her plan. We'd set a trap, using fire to drive the creature away or kill it. We worked quickly, dousing a perimeter around the RV with gasoline and rigging makeshift torches. As night fell, the forest grew deathly quiet. Then it came. The creature lunged out of the darkness, slamming into the side of the RV with enough force to rattle the cabinets inside. Megan and I lit the torches and stepped outside, our backs to the vehicle. The firelight revealed the wendigo in all its horrifying glory. Emaciated, its ribs protruding through its stretched skin, its mouth a black hole of endless hunger. It screeched and charged at us, but Megan held her ground, swinging her torch. The flames drove it back, but it was relentless, circling us like a predator hunting its prey. I grabbed the gasoline canister and hurled it toward the creature, dousing it. Megan threw her torch, and the wendigo went up in flames, its screams echoing through the forest. We didn't stop to watch it burn. We ran. Megan led the way, guiding me through the woods to her ranger station. We collapsed inside, locking the door behind us. "You okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. What the hell was that thing? She didn't answer, just stared out the window at the faint glow of the fire still burning in the distance. Days later, I left Mount Hood, vowing never to return. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every night, I check the locks on my RV and look out into the darkness, expecting to see those hollow black eyes staring back at me. And sometimes I do. My name is Marcus Hall, and I was 41 when this happened. After years of firefighting, I thought I'd seen the worst the world had to offer. I'd walked through burning buildings, pulled people from wreckage, and faced down death more times than I care to count. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced in Deschutes National Forest. It was early September when I decided to take a week-long trip to Sparks Lake. I'd been living in my RV for almost a year, crisscrossing the country, chasing solitude and clarity after retiring early. I told myself it was for my PTSD, for my need to escape the noise and chaos of the city. But if I'm being honest, I was running. From my past, my guilt, and the memories of a friend I couldn't save. I arrived at the campground just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the dense pine forest smelled of earth and resin. It was beautiful, almost peaceful. I set up my RV in a clearing near the lake, about a mile from the main trail. There was no one else around, which suited me fine. The first night passed without incident. I sat outside under a blanket of stars, the silence broken only by the crackle of my campfire and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. Sleep came easily for once, and I thought maybe this trip would be good for me. The second night, things started to change. I was sitting by the fire sipping coffee when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched laugh. It echoed through the trees, distant at first, then closer. It sounded like a child, but there was something off about it. Too sharp, too wrong. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the tree line. "Hello?" I called, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing, probably a bird or some animal making a strange noise. But as I sat back down, the laughter came again, this time from the opposite direction. My pulse quickened. I decided to head inside the RV and lock the door. Maybe I was just imagining things. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Everything seemed normal, and I convinced myself I'd overreacted. To clear my head, I decided to hike the trail that looped around the lake. The forest was dense, the trail barely visible in some places, but I enjoyed the challenge. About halfway through the hike, I stumbled across something unusual. A flat, moss-covered rock jutted out from the ground, and carved into its surface were the words, "They laugh last." I crouched to get a closer look. The carving was old, the letters weathered but deep. A shiver ran through me. It felt like a warning, but from who or what? I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the screen froze. The camera app wouldn't open, and none of the buttons worked. Frustrated, I shoved it back in my pocket and moved on. That night, the laughter returned. It started just as I was cleaning up after dinner. Soft and distant, then louder, closer. It seemed to move through the trees, circling my campsite. My skin prickled as I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The laughter stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was making it had been caught. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I scanned the woods, my flashlight catching glimpses of branches and undergrowth. For a moment, I thought I saw movement. A shadow darting between the trees. I stepped back, my chest tightening. The laughter erupted again, this time directly behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My hands trembled as I locked myself inside the RV and drew the curtains. The laughter continued for hours, fading in and out until I finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I found claw marks on the side of my RV. Long, deep gouges that cut through the paint and into the metal. My fishing gear, which I'd left outside, was shredded. Rods snapped, tackle scattered. My first thought was a bear, but there were no tracks, no other signs of an animal nearby. Besides, the marks were too deliberate, almost precise. I packed up my damaged gear and decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to find some clue about what was happening. That's when I found the clearing. The space was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. At its center stood a series of totems made of bones, twigs, and bits of fabric. They were crude, but unmistakable. Human figures, their heads tilted back as if laughing. My stomach turned as I approached them, the air growing colder with every step. Something caught my eye near the base of one of the totems. It was a dog tag. My dog tag. I hadn't even realized it was missing, but there it was, tied to the figure with a piece of sinewy cord. I felt my throat tighten, my pulse thundering in my ears. How had it gotten here? Who or what had put it there? That night, the RV felt like a coffin. The laughter was louder now, relentless, coming from every direction. The lights flickered, and my flashlight died despite fresh batteries. My breathing grew shallow as the walls seemed to close in around me. Then I heard my name. Marcus. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. It sounded like Eric, my old co-worker, the one I couldn't save. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to move, to do something, but I couldn't. The voice came again, closer. "Marcus, why didn't you save me?" The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. My vision blurred as tears welled up, and for a moment I felt like I was back in that burning building, watching the flames consume him. But then I heard the laughter again, rising above the voice, mocking me. Something snapped inside me. Anger replaced fear as I grabbed my survival knife and stormed outside. The laughter grew louder, almost deafening, as I made my way back to the clearing. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't sit there and let it win. The clearing was just as I'd left it, the totems standing like sentinels. I approached the one with my dog tag and yanked it free, the cord snapping easily in my hand. The air around me seemed to ripple, the shadows growing darker. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice raw. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not afraid of you." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The shadows moved, coalescing into a tall, spindly figure. Its face was a blur, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It loomed over me, silent but menacing. I didn't run. I held my ground, clutching the dog tag like a talisman. The figure hesitated, as if unsure what to do. Then, slowly, it faded back into the darkness, and the forest grew quiet once more. I left the next morning, driving until I was miles away from the forest. The damage to my RV was real, as were the photos of the carvings and totems. But when I looked at the picture of the clearing later, something chilled me to my core. There was a shadow in the background, tall and spindly, standing just behind me. I hadn't seen it at the time, but it had been there, watching. I don't know what I encountered in Deschutes National Forest, and I don't plan to go back to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laughter,